I'm so delighted, to have had the privilege now to have met Erik Carter. You heard Bill refer to him as well. I wish we could clone him and have an Erik Carter on every university campus in the education department, teaching teachers how to work in the world of special education, so that in my terms, eventually there would be no definition of special education. It would be person first teaching, and that would be an amazing, wonderful thing. But for now, Erik has he's got quite the task, and but he's committed to it. And when I first got my job, the day after I met Bill, I saw this book on my predecessor's desk, Terry Ketcher, who is here in the back. Thank you. Y'all thank her, because without her, there would have been no Faith Inclusion Network. And it was kind of like manna from heaven. You know, there was this book on my desk, and it was by Erik Carter, People with Disabilities in Faith Communities, a guide for service providers, families, and congregations. I started to read it, and I knew that Bill had said we were doing this symposium, and I thought, gee, let's have Bill come back, and let's also have Erik come back. And one of the chapters in the book was the other 6 days, and that just struck me, because inclusion is not just on the day of worship. It's every day. So I'm excited to have Erik back with us, and want him to come on up. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. Good morning. Pleased to be able to join you this morning. It's been an incredible week for those of you who've been here all week, and I think today will also be such a compelling day. I mean, just getting to know and learning from so many individuals who are striving to create communities where every gift finds a place and where everyone belongs and where everyone has an opportunity to serve. As she shared, I come to you from Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm a researcher and a scholar there, and much of the work that I do focuses on identifying those skills and the supports and the opportunities and relationships that young people with significant disabilities need to really flourish in communities. Young people with labels like intellectual disability and autism and Down syndrome. So I really focus a lot of my work on doing research on what it looks like to serve those young people well in our schools, in our workplaces, in our communities, and also in our congregations. So you're probably a little surprised that this planning committee would invite a social scientist to this conference, especially one that's focused on the intersection of faith and disability. You might have thought, well, no one else must have been available, but have no fear. Like any good researcher, I thought about what should I present at a conference on faith and theology and disability, and so I have decided that I am going to preach from numbers. All right? So, and I literally mean numbers, literally. So if you haven't had your coffee, take a sip. These are numbers that highlight, I think, incredible opportunities for communities of faith to help their members to flourish in faith in all of life, numbers that might serve as a catalyst for your congregation to think much more broadly about what it means to be in community with one another, numbers that remind us that too many people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are living on the margins of community life, and that includes faith community life. But there are also things we can do to change that landscape, but we have to be intentional in our efforts to do that. You know, often the conversations that we have at conferences like this focus on our efforts to welcome and to weave people into times of worship, our religious education programs, other activities that take place within the walls of our congregation. And because God's call on us to be places of hospitality has not really always received an adequate response, and all of our very well-crafted position statements about why we ought to be inclusive, and we have many, many of those, they are inconsistently put into practice. And our sanctuaries are not always places of sanctuary for people with disabilities and their families. We have to be intentional about making sure that we're accessible in every way so that everyone can get in. But I find myself just as concerned about our ability and our willingness to get out, at least out together. Because I think a faith community that focuses narrowly on what happens within the walls of our congregation or the walls of our building, we might be integrated for a day a week in a sense, but I wonder if we're really fully realizing our potential to be an inclusive community that walks together the other 6 days of the week. So we're going to turn our attention to what happens on the other side of the congregation door. I've put on the screen a very beautiful congregation door that you'll notice is incredibly, completely inaccessible. That was to make a point. So we want to think about what happens after the benediction, what happens the other 6 days of the week. What would it look like to support young people with disabilities and their families to flourish beyond the walls of our congregation? And to set the stage for doing this, I want to share with you 5 points that I think you'll find have very strong empirical support, research support, and hopefully some theological support as well. And here's the first point. At least according to my research, I might be wrong, most typical weeks have 7 days. At least on average. I've confirmed this by checking a number of local calendars, Texas calendars. To a T, they all have 7 days, and I even consulted some of the theologians this week about the description in Genesis. That too describes 7 days. There's great consensus here. I think the only exception historically is when we switched to the Gregorian calendar. I think we skipped 10 days to kind of jump forward, but that was the only time that I know there wasn't 7 days. But I digress. I share this ridiculous reflection because it punctuates, I think, an important point. And I want you to consider how much of our efforts to foster community and shared lives among members of our congregation are limited to when we gather for worship on Sunday morning or Saturday night or Friday or whenever we do that. I mean, how much of our efforts focus on those 2 or 3 hours a week, and there they are, when we're present in these facilities, relative to that remaining 165 hours when we're living life in the neighborhoods that surround our buildings. Only a small fraction of our lives happen here, unless you're clergy, of course. So I suspect that what we do or what we don't do from Monday to Saturday may have a greater impact on the lives of people with developmental disabilities and their families than what we do on Sunday morning. It's not a call at all to take your eyes off what happens during our times of worship and religious education, but really to challenge you to think much bigger, which you can do in Texas, and broadly beyond Sunday morning. So that's the first point. Second point, to segue into what Bill foreshadowed, throughout those other 6 days, people with disabilities are present in every single neighborhood and community and county across our country. They may not have a presence in our faith communities, but they're present in our communities. And there's a thing you could play with there about the difference between being present and having a presence, which we'll come back to a little bit later. But disability is a natural part of the human condition, right? And for those other 6 days, what we do or don't do becomes all the more important. So consider a few more numbers. 2 to 3% of any single community in the country has labels like, are people who have labels like intellectual disability or autism, Down syndrome, or other developmental disabilities. 2 to 3% of any single community. And that means in a city like Dallas, over 1 million people, 1.2 million people, there are 30,000 children and adults in this community alone who fit that particular description. We know that about 1 out of 5, 19% of all Americans have disabilities. That means in this city alone, we're talking about 250,000 people who have the label of disability of some kind. And we also know that 1 out of every 3 families, almost 1 out of every 3 families, has a relative or member with a disability. So how many families go to your particular congregation? 1 out of 3. So I know these numbers are not at all striking to this audience. You've heard them a million times perhaps, but they're new to congregation members whose lives almost never interact with people with disabilities. And so when you hear that phrase from congregations that Bill mentioned and is right on this booklet that you have on your table, that we don't have people with disabilities in our congregation, otherwise we would certainly welcome them. You have the numbers to challenge that assertion. And really then the response is, really, okay, how can I help make some introductions for you? So those numbers always seem abstract. People say, Eric, there you go again with your data. make it real. And so I do this now in almost every presentation I do, is try to put this in very concrete local terms. And what if you were to step outside of this building, out of this church, and start to walk into the neighborhoods that surround this church, your congregation, your synagogue, wherever you happen to live, and you actually decided you're going to knock on doors and meet your neighbors? I did that last night. These are pictures of the congregation up on the screen. It's an aerial view of this church, and just south of it, the community that surrounds it. What you'd find is if that you knocked on doors, 1 out of 3 or 1 out of 4 households that you knocked on would include a family member, a family impacted by disability directly. These are the little circles are popping up all across this neighborhood. It could be those houses. Now, I didn't actually literally knock on those doors, so if you just see your house, right? But it makes a point, right? When we think about community, are we thinking about our community too narrowly? So the third point, houses of worship have a ubiquitous presence in communities across the United States. And I'm told there's a few in Canada too. That's right? Okay. More than a few. They're the hubs of small towns, a social epicenter, and they're pervasive in larger communities. In Nashville, we say there's a church on every corner, and I've put on the screen, literally, this is not from Nashville, a picture of the community. There's a church on every corner, right? 335,000 places of worship in the United States. You'll love this number because you are the biggest in Texas. 27,848 congregations in this state alone. Let me illustrate it in a different way. I couldn't visit the entire state, but if you're skeptical, every red dot on this map of Dallas, every red dot is a congregation, and that's not even all of them. And if you can't see the map, it looks like it has chicken pox. It's filled with congregations. And for those of you whose congregation name is not showing up on here, you probably need to pay some money to Google. I don't know how they show up. I didn't pick them, but they're everywhere, all right? Fourth point, most faith communities, I think, would affirm the importance of helping their members to flourish in all aspects of life, spiritually, vocationally, educationally, relationally, many, many other ways. And so what is it that helps people with intellectual disabilities and autism and developmental disabilities and their families to flourish? I can't answer that because you have to do what Bill said. You ask them. Sit down with a family, invest in their lives, get to know it, and you'll discover that. But I anticipate the answers that you would find are going to be very, very familiar. A good job, a safe and comfortable place to live, a best friend, something to do, a place to belong, a chance to contribute, a family who loves them. Because whether or not someone has a disability is usually not a very reliable predictor of what they want for their lives or their aspirations or the things that help them thrive. Those kinds of categories become very unuseful here. And in fact, it's better to think about what helps any of us thrive, what helps any of us flourish. So this leads to my fifth point, and I think it's become part of the vernacular to talk about special needs ministries. So if you think about what it is that really helps people with developmental disabilities and their families flourish, I start to question whether what we're really doing is talking about special needs ministries. In fact, the most pressing needs, I think, are those that really aren't that special or unique to people with developmental disabilities. They're quite ordinary. They're quite universal. So a meaningful job, a safe place to live, something to do, a best friend, place to belong, chance to contribute, a family who loves them. These are the very same things that contribute to each of our own flourishing. You all know those things. And so it strikes me that some of those things are very difficult to truly address if we're only involved in people's lives for a couple hours on a Sunday morning. I love the name of this ministry. It says on the top, Human Needs Ministry, East Fort Bend. Actually has nothing to do with our topic, but I think it causes me to think perhaps this is really we have to think about what we're doing in this area of ministry, right? It's really about meeting the core needs we all have to flourish, not special needs. So why might this be helpful? Well, maybe it would be helpful for us to see our fellow congregation members and our neighbors with developmental disabilities in terms of what we all share in common, what our universal aspirations are, rather than by what we perceive distinguishes us, by the categories we are fit into. Maybe it helps us to see that we actually already know what we need to know to help other people live good, enviable lives. That a prerequisite for doing disability ministry is not having some expertise in special education or behavior analysis or holding some particular degree, but rather thinking first about the things people do in your life that help you flourish and doing those things with other people who have labels of disabilities. And maybe it would help us to see also that a program may not always have to be the first response when we think about supporting people with disabilities and their families. Maybe. So what would it look like for a congregation to play a role in helping to meet some of the needs that I just talked about, to support flourishing in this segment of their community? I want you to encourage you to really prayerfully consider some new possibilities for your congregation, either individually or how you might begin to work together in tandem here in Dallas or whatever community you're part of to begin to make an impact. And I'm going to share some ideas just to kind of whet your appetite in 4 areas. How do we help people connect to a meaningful job, a good place to live? How do we make sure people are known and belong and have friends you can count on? And how do we support families really well who are walking alongside their sons and daughters with developmental disabilities every day? There's certainly others that we could park on if we had more time this morning. And I don't want you to think of any of this as prescriptive. It's just designed to illustrate some possibilities and to challenge you to think about some new avenues through which your faith community could really have an impact. And I think also put yourself in a position where you could be impacted. So I want to start with the world of work. Bill mentioned this earlier in his talk as well. We know that when people with developmental disabilities are connected to meaningful jobs in their communities, it becomes all the more easier to help them achieve all the other goals that contribute to their own thriving. We know this because it's true for us as well. A good job is much more than just about promoting financial well-being. It contributes to a sense of accomplishment, self-worth, independence, gives us a place to share our strengths and our gifts in valued ways, leads to new friendships, provides us with the kinds of resources and connections we need to enhance our involvement in the community, and it also provides us a context to live out our particular calling. The right job is vocation, the wrong job, no job, is often a sentence. And my point here is just that meaningful work can make a profound difference in the lives of many adults living in this community who have developmental disabilities. And you think about the very first few questions you inevitably ask someone when you first meet them. Bill pointed this out for us earlier in a conversation this week. The question is, what do you do? What do you do? And it's hard for many people with developmental disabilities to answer that question, and it's been hard for lots of people in our communities in the current economic times of the last 4 or 5 years to answer that question. But whatever employment metric you have out there, whatever statistic, they all seem to converge on these 2 really simple points. There are far too many people with developmental disabilities who are not having a chance to share their gifts and talents and friendship within a place of work, and there are too many employers who are missing out on opportunities to benefit from the contributions people with disabilities are making to the success, to the culture, and even the bottom line of their organization. Many of you are familiar with work that companies like Walgreens and Lowe's and others are doing, and what they're learning actually about how their business culture and ultimately their bottom line is better off because of the contributions of people with disabilities. And the numbers, when you think about the statistics, are staggering and create an opportunity. We know that 75% of people with cognitive disabilities in Texas are unemployed. That number was the unemployment rate, 75% unemployment rate. We know that only 5%, 1 out of every 20 people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in Texas, is served in integrated employment, opportunities to work alongside others who don't have the label of developmental disability. And so if that's the case, think about how many people are missing the opportunity in our community to see the contribution, people with disabilities in terms of their contributions and what they bring to community. As recently, at least as April, the unemployment rate for people with disabilities was double what it was for people without disabilities, about 12.5%. But what's most striking about that is only 1 out of 5 people with disabilities is even in the labor force. They've given up even working, struggling to find a job. 6 years after leaving high school, not even half of young people with autism have had a paid job at any point in those 6 years, even though the purpose of special education is actually to transition people into jobs and college and a good life in the community. So these aren't numbers that change amidst the cyclical swings of good and bad economies, and the service system has struggled to turn these kinds of numbers around. The last few decades, these have not changed at all. So you see the missed opportunities here. There's members of our community who are losing out on opportunities to work alongside their neighbors with disabilities, to see them for their talents and gifts and contributions. And I think we're increasingly convinced that the solution to unemployment doesn't reside in the service system alone. We really have to think about how do we engage natural community partners in these kinds of efforts if we're going to change the landscape. So faith communities have an opportunity here to transform the lives of people with disabilities related to the area of work by helping them to find meaningful jobs, to assume valued roles in their community, to share their gifts and their vocations with others. And also, congregations already have the capacity to do this. You already have everything you need to know and do to be able to do this well. Bill's written in a great white paper on this topic, and I'll point you to the website where you can find that soon, that such an investment really builds on our scriptural understandings of the dignity of work, a stewardship of one's talents and gifts, and the responsibility of our communities to support those on the margins. Our congregations can get to know people in ways that a broken service system never can, to understand their strengths and gifting and sense of calling in a way that providers are just not primed to do, and they can do that from an entirely different sort of motivation. So what do I mean by you already have the capacity to do this? Faith communities like this one, like yours, are probably one of the most extensive networks of employers in every community. The average congregation has about 186 or so attendees. And so think about the potential employers within just your church or synagogue or other place of worship who are represented even in a small congregation. It might be filled with people like this. Someone who works at a local university, someone who coordinates a nonprofit network, someone who just does odd jobs around town and has all kinds of opportunities there, someone who operates a local daycare, and it goes on and on. So who's your congregation filled with? It's employers, employees, people connected to organizations and businesses in every corner of your community who may be inclined to help one of their own who's part of that congregation. And the gift that perhaps they've never thought of to share with people with disabilities is their own connections and relationships in the community. And many of the jobs that are represented in your congregation are ones that a service system job developers would never think of, never know about, and never have an entry point to. Because the primary barrier to employment for people with disabilities isn't doing the work. It's finding the employer who's willing to give that opportunity, the willing to make that hire. So when you take time to discover that you have a young woman with a disability who would love to work at a dental office, and this happened for me as a transition teacher here in Texas when we found out this is the case, we discovered also there were 5 people in that congregation who worked in dental offices in that community and made an introduction for us. This is not a real congregation I'm part of, just an illustration. And I'm putting on the screen pictures of a congregation with sort of examples of where people might work, right? But it's also an association of people who are frankly connected to lots of other people. And it's through our personal connections that most of us get their jobs. How many of you got your first job in middle school or high school or elsewhere because of a family or a friend or someone else you know, by a show of hands? Should be 87% of you. Close there, right, something like that. Just kidding. Social scientists tell us the average person has a network size of about 150 people. Maybe up to 600 people. That means each of us knows at least 150 people, multiply 150 times the member of your congregation. And so when you spend time getting to know someone, you start to realize who are all the people that your congregations are connected to as well. There's people in your congregations who are part of the Chamber of Commerce, who are in book clubs, who volunteer with Habitat for Humanity, and on and on and on. And you start to see you've got people who know people who know people. And that same sort of capacity exists when it comes to thinking about how do we support someone to go from where they are to a job in the community? How do we support someone to make those kinds of connections? And so think about the talents and the experiences that exist in your congregation that are exactly what someone needs to make an employment connection. And so it might be things like there's someone who could hire someone in their business, someone at your church who could hire someone at the church, someone who'd be willing to lead a job club, who already writes beautiful resumes and could show someone else how to do it, someone who's great at interviewing and could help someone practice, someone who could do on and on and on and on. All sorts of talents and gifts there. And people have never thought about those as gifts that someone else with a developmental disability might need to receive. So these are associations and connections that also can be drawn upon in lots of other areas as well. So think about what the employment landscape I shared with you could change if we were just intentional here. Not for dozens and scores of people or hundreds of people, but just thinking about one person at a time, one or two or three people who are connected to your congregation. And here's some ideas for what you could do. We're seeing other congregations do this as well. Clergy could invite and encourage their members to be advocates within their own workplaces for hiring people with disabilities. They might promote National Disability Employment Awareness Month, which is in October. So that might come from the pulpit and saying, hey, let's be about this in our community. Even better, I would love to see our churches hiring people with disabilities. What if a fraction of the 28,000 congregations in the state and all the faith-based daycares, nursing homes, hospitals, and ministries made a commitment to hire people with disabilities? Those employment numbers would just start to evaporate. What if congregations on their own or in partnership with other congregations who already have employment-related outreach ministries just made sure people with disabilities were part of those? Lots of congregations have job clubs or employment connection programs. Make sure people with disabilities are part of those as well. Or maybe you could start a new initiative in your congregation, like Bill alluded to, our Putting Faith to Work project, that simply involves walking alongside people with developmental disabilities on the pathway to employment. We're trying to create a flexible model that any congregation who could use to support employment, really of any member, but particularly members with disabilities. We're inviting congregations to reflect on who in their congregation might benefit from this sort of circle of support, who might get to know these individuals in a way that makes apparent their interests and experiences and work-related goals, to draw upon the personal connections and the creativity and the commitment of others in that congregation to make those linkages to real jobs for real pay, and to offer encouragement and support all along the way. Congregations can also start to support the work of agencies in your community who share this commitment and who really do need natural partners to do their own jobs well. So the starting point for you might be people who are already connected to your congregation, or to reach out and use this as an avenue for meeting needs beyond the walls of your congregation. Not only are you going to address the underemployment issue by investing here, what you also start to do is engage a much larger cross-section of your congregation in getting to know their neighbors with disabilities in ways they might not otherwise have. Not every person with developmental disabilities or their families is going to want to draw upon faith communities. We know that, but many will. In Tennessee, we're in the midst of a larger study of family expectations around employment. We've asked already 1,000 families about the supports that they'd be willing to access in their community, and nearly 2/3 say they would turn to be somewhat or very likely to turn to someone in their faith community to help make connections for their son or daughter with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So my colleagues here in Texas, Penny, where are you? Penny Say and Bill Gaventa, along with folks in Tennessee, Minnesota, Kentucky, we're developing resources in this area of work that will be available soon on puttingfaithtowork.org. There's a great poster outside, and if you're a local congregation that says, we want to invest in this issue, talk to Penny, talk to Bill about how to get involved. There are also groups like the Interfaith Disability Advocacy Network trying to spur the religious community to start speaking out and taking action on issues like employment as well. So I spent a little more time on that than I am on the others, not because of the others aren't important, but just to sort of set the stage about how you tap into these connections. Because having a safe and comfortable place to live, not just in the community, but also in community, is another aspect of thriving, a place where congregations are making a real difference. Nationally, our legislation, our policies increasingly reflect a commitment to helping people move out of institutions and congregate segregated residential programs and into sort of living situations like anyone else in a community lives. And that's not just good for people with developmental disabilities, but as Judith Snow pointed out, essential gifts are missing from our community when certain members aren't living among us. But our funding, our practices fall so far short of reflecting this commitment. And the service system is well beyond its capacity to really help people with developmental disabilities live in community and in the community. And like all things in Texas, the numbers here are pretty big. There are 8,000 people with intellectual and developmental disabilities who still live in large segregated residential programs, 4,400 in intermediate care facilities. So the challenge here is how can the places of worship, how can congregations help find people places and pathways to support them to live more in community and in the community. And there's 20,000 people living in supported employment supported living situations, 15,000 people in supported living situations like group homes who are in your community but may have very few connections to others who live there. So how do you begin to make sure they're known as our neighbors? And there's, within these numbers too, opportunities for people of faith, opportunities for congregations. What might that look like? Well, there are lots of congregations, lots of faith-based organizations that already operate supported living programs, small group homes, and supporting faith-based opportunities gives people with developmental disabilities an option to live in context where their faith commitments, their religious traditions will be honored and supported and celebrated. There are also networks of congregations within a city that might start to work in tandem to begin to spur and support intentional communities that enable people with and without disabilities to live together. I've enjoyed this week learning from Justin and Lisa Hancock about their efforts here to do this, but finding ways to create new opportunities for people to live in community is another pathway. We know congregations already make great strides to meet the material needs and other needs of new immigrants, of people returning from correctional centers, of single parents, people impacted by poverty. And so how do we do those same things for people with developmental disabilities who want to live in community? How do we support them there? Congregations can be advocates for accessible and affordable and inclusive housing options in their local community. You can partner with housing coalitions to identify residential needs and try to explore avenues for making real change in your community on a much broader scale. And finally, our faith communities can start thinking outside of the box and start spurring new and innovative housing options. A lot of you are familiar with the Friendship House at Western Theological Seminary. We'll be there in a couple years at the Summer Institute. And now there's a Friendship House at Duke in North Carolina. These are residence halls where seminarians with and without developmental disabilities have a chance to live together in community. It meets a real housing need, absolutely. But think about the changes that the impact it will have on those congregations when those seminarians graduate, having lived in community with people with developmental disabilities. How might their leadership in their future congregations be fundamentally different because they've had those experiences? So start to think about how do we sort of begin to invite Perkins and Baylor and SMU and TCU to consider these kinds of new housing options as well. So a good job and a place to live are important, but it's relationships that are at the heart of what makes community so rich and brings such fulfillment to our lives. Having somewhere we belong and someone who remembers our birthday, someone who invites us over for a cookout, who notices when we didn't show up and we're not there, someone who loves us, someone we love. We're created to be in a relationship. And yet friendships rarely receive much serious attention within our service systems. We've talked before about friends really, laws can't make us be friends. They create space for that, but they can't make friendships. And so the one thing that we could do that perhaps would have the greatest impact on flourishing would be to create meaningful opportunities for people with and without developmental disabilities to meet one another, to get involved in each other's lives, and to perhaps discover the gift of new friendships. And the great thing about this gesture are, well, first, it requires no training, no special degree. In fact, all you have to know is how to dispense hospitality. And unless you're a church where they delegate all that to the hospitality team, it's something you can freely do. Hopefully that doesn't happen. And second, forging friendships doesn't require you to start any new program or any other funded ministry at your congregation. And third, as Judith Snow pointed out for us a couple days ago, you might just be surprised at who the real beneficiaries are of these new connections. So why is this work so important? What's often not apparent to congregations is just how isolated people with developmental disabilities can be in their community. Think about the relationships that are important to you, your family members, those people who are your friends, your close companions, the people you spend time with at the workplace, your neighbors and others who are acquaintances. And then, of course, there's those people who are paid to be in your life that are so important for a variety of reasons. The issue is that for many people with developmental disabilities, particularly people who have more expensive support needs, they have lots of relationships, lots and lots of relationships. But when you start to place those names on this chart, they show up in two circles. They show up in the families, and they show up in the circle of people paid to be there. And so it's here where congregations can start to fill in those two inner circles. People with developmental disabilities need relationships far more than they need programs. Erik needs relationships far more than I need any kind of program. We all do, but our tendency is always to start some program before investing in relationships. Why is that so important? A whole host of studies point out just how elusive these relationships are. Nearly half of young people with autism do not have a single friend of a same-age peer, not one. Another study shows 8 years after leaving high school, 52% of young adults with autism, 42% of young adults with intellectual disability don't see friends outside of work or school weekly. And a recent study in the UK of 6,500 people, not people with disabilities, came to a very simple conclusion that we already know. Loneliness hurts, but social isolation literally kills us. It literally shortens our lives. So how do you foster friendships? I don't know. I mean, I don't have a recipe for this, right? But there are definitely some key ingredients. Got to have shared activities, typically common interests, usually valued roles, and regular opportunities to spend time together. And the great thing about congregations is that they're filled with people who have interests and hobbies and passions and rich community connections. And that's how we develop friendships, is usually on the basis of some common interests, right? So on here, these might be, I don't know if these are real ones or not. So let me illustrate. I've totally lost it now. On the screen, I've just put a picture of a congregation and little blurbs that show what people might be interested in, right? So you find out what someone is interested in, what their perseveration is if they have autism, and you find out who in that congregation has that passion. So if you have autism, it's a perseveration. If you don't, it's a passion, is the distinction, I guess. So just to illustrate, there was a group home that contacted church to let them know a few male residents from a group home. We're going to be joining their congregation later in the month, and they wanted to make them feel at home. So the pastor made an announcement during the service that said some variation on, we've got a few men who have intellectual disabilities who are going to be coming to our congregation. If you want to be part of a small group that takes steps to welcome them and make them feel part of this place, come down after the service and I'll let you know about an opportunity that you can do that. Guess how many people came down after the service? 0, right? So someone went over the group home, spent a little time, got to know these men. Pastor, a little bit later, extended the invitation, and he pitched it totally differently. He said, who in this congregation this is a Wisconsin story, so I apologize for the reference. Who in this congregation is an absolute diehard Green Bay Packers fan? Who loves to get together on Monday nights with other men to drink whatever, eat brats, eat cheese, shout at the screen? If you love to do that, come down after the service. I've got an opportunity for you. Guess how many men came down? It's Wisconsin. There's more than 50 men came down. And the opportunity was then, look, here's a chance. We've got some men who love the Packers. They have no one to watch it with. That's something you know how to do. Bill gave some illustrations of this in our workshop the other day. That's how you connect, right? On the basis of common interests. So connect perseverations with other people's passions, I guess. Find out what someone loves to do, to talk about, to be around, to spend time with, to go to, and then find people in your congregation or community who love those things. And now you realize you don't need any expertise except that common interest that you have in common. So what are other things congregations can do? Well, commit to inclusive programming. If all aspects of what you do, children's programming, youth groups, small groups, adult Bible studies, whatever you do, fellowship activities, it's a natural way to bring together people around common interests, shared activities. Make sure they're accessible, but make sure people get invited. Announcing that you have something going on in your church is totally different than inviting someone to that. Very few of us show up at birthday parties because they were announced. Some of you do, and we'll talk about that. You should be invited. It's a whole nother, okay. Second is relationships form over time. You know that. And the simple things you do are sharing a meal, catching a movie together, grabbing a cup of coffee, going to the mall, coming by my house to watch the Cowboys game, stopping in to check how someone's doing, how their job's going, to ask about their family, right? To pray together. People with developmental disabilities have the very same ordinary and extraordinary life experiences we have. So just being involved in someone's life and having a friend makes all the difference there. You can reach out to a local group home or supported living programs and let them know about what's happening in your congregation, the ways you're getting together, and extend those invitations. And you might even consider developing circles of support around particular individuals with developmental disabilities in an effort to create consistent, durable networks of friends, of relationships. Judith Snow talked about this on Wednesday. And you can also explore partnerships with some of the ministries that really are intentional about this. Groups like Friendship Ministries, Young Life Capernaum, other ministries that focus on friendships. Don't, in all these efforts, overlook the powerful barrier that the lack of transportation has in all of this. Many people with developmental disabilities can't come to your activities unless staff bring them. They often don't drive, and so unless the ride is provided, they're likely not to be there as well. All right, and last, let's turn to families, because well more than half of children and adults with developmental disabilities live with their families. And so making sure families are well supported is really important to helping people with developmental disabilities to flourish. It's really encouraging to hear the wonderful ways that congregations are surrounding these families and embracing them and journeying alongside them. But the stories go both ways. We hear families who talk about the welcome they receive and families who leave just feeling wounded. We have families that really feel like that they are welcomed in and others that get turned away. And we just don't think families should have to raise the challenges of raising any child, including children with developmental disabilities, apart from the love and the care and the support of their faith community. So if you want to know what supports will make a real difference in the lives of families, ask them. All right? And you'll be probably surprised to discover that many of the things they mention first are the ordinary things that any family would mention about what would help support them as well. They're often it's the ordinary gestures that are more important than the special ones that are tied to disability. But we have also, in our own work, our own research, spent time asking families about what other things congregations can do beyond those that would be really helpful to them as they're raising their sons and daughters with developmental disabilities. And we finished just recently a study involving almost 500 families across the state of Tennessee. I shared an early glimpse of this a couple years ago at the Summer Institute, but these are our final updated data. We asked parents to consider a whole variety of supports that their congregation could conceivably provide. And we said, assuming each of these were available in your congregation, how helpful would this be to you personally in raising your son or daughter with developmental disabilities? And these are very concrete things you might be able to do, but here's what these families said. The biggest support that they identified out of all this list was actually just broad awareness efforts in your congregation. Disability awareness efforts. 70% of families said that would be incredibly helpful for us. They talked about having an advocate for families in their congregation, someone who could sit down with them, ask them what would it look like to make Sunday or Saturday morning the very best day of the week for you and your family, what could we do? And that person goes back to the congregation and does the asking. 68% of families said that would be really helpful. Resources for families, just to help us navigate all the complexity of living in community and the service systems that surround disability. Where do we turn for support? Make that information available for families. Spiritual counseling from a congregational leader. 2/3 of parents said that would be so important to us at this point in our lives. A support group for parents, respite care, and it goes on and on and on. And you can kind of see the range of things that families thought would be really, really important. Right. What I just popped up down the right side of the screen is the percentage of congregations that actually do any of these. So it's the difference between these two numbers that's the opportunity for you. Disability awareness efforts, 70% of families say that'd be really helpful. 10% of congregations do that. Having spiritual counseling from a congregational leader, families want that. Guess how many parents say their congregation has that available? Only 1 out of 3. Respite care, only 8% of congregations do that. So here's an opportunity. There's a great variability here. Don't take this list and say, well, go do all these things. Talk to families about what would be most helpful. But these are the kinds of gestures that many families are asking for. And so think about what might be a point of influence here. So what would this look like in your congregation? Actually, I don't have time to show you, so I'm going to do it a different way. all of you will have access to, it's either on that hard drive or you can download when you've done your evaluation, a guide that we built, that we wrote based on those 14 supports. It walks through why these might be important, some practical steps congregations can take in each of those 14 areas, and resources where you can learn more. It's free, it's downloadable, and you can share that with congregations that you work with. But I emphasize, you start with each family and find out what it would look like to support them well, rather than making any presumptions about we should do all the things in that guide that I just shared with you. So a whirlwind of ideas and 3 minutes over, but primarily to spur your own creativity and prayerful discernment of ways you might walk alongside members in your community throughout all 7 days of the week. And just a few kind of brief final points as we proceed. The first is that know that your congregation already has the connections and the care and the creativity to undertake any of these efforts, and a whole host of others. The needed expertise is already among you, but what's missing often is the intentionality, the commitment, the time investment. And second, there's a service system out there, a disability service system out there, and it's not perfect, but they can be critical allies in these efforts and such a valuable source of support when you do feel like you need extra expertise. Many of the people who work in the service system might be members of your congregation as well. So find ways to reach out. This might be new territory for you, but to figure out how you might work in tandem with a service system that also wants to help people with developmental disabilities to flourish, but they struggle to have the partners to do that well. And third, I think the relationships, making the kinds of connections that I'm talking about becomes all the more easier when you start by a conversation about strengths and talents rather than struggles. It's really hard for us to find a place for a list of deficits. And when the prevailing view about people is so deficit-based, you have to start to think about, well, what are the interests and passions and the experiences and the strengths that someone has? And that's how I make the introduction to relationships, to jobs, to other aspects of community life. And fourth, start one person at a time. Think one person at a time. Our tendency is to start a program and then invite people who have certain labels into that program. Instead, start with an individual and then invite people to get involved in the life of that particular individual. One person at a time, which means what you do is going to look different with each person that you're walking alongside. And fifth, and it's not a twist anymore because this permeated Bill's talk, the recurring lesson of all of these efforts, it seems to me that when we are really taking steps to help other people flourish, what we discover is that it's actually me who benefits as well. Community was designed to be that way. We all have gifts that other people need, and if we take that seriously, it means that we have need for gifts other people have. We're reluctant on that side of the equation. But I think as other people have illustrated so well throughout the past week, our rigid and often static notions of who is the giver and the receiver, who's the supporter and the one being supported, all of those get overturned when we really invest in these sorts of relationships, and that's a good thing when that happens. So taking you back to the starting point, a truly welcoming congregation extends a welcome how many days a week? 7 days a week, right? And our efforts to weave people into community life have to stretch beyond the walls of our congregations, into our neighborhoods, into our work